Hello, Hopewell Presbyterian. My name is Heath Carter, and I am an associate professor of American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. I'm just starting my second year here at the seminary, and I've gotten to know some of your congregation already. Look forward to getting to know more of you and to spend 2 sessions with you thinking through questions of identity. In this session in particular, I want to think with you a little bit about the kind of intersection of race with American Christianity and the long history there and the ways that history shapes our identity today. So I thought I'd start with a story. I spent my 20s and early 30s in the city of Chicago. Love Chicago. I don't know how much time you may or may not have spent there, but a wonderful city and a place still near and dear to my heart. Really still feels like home in many ways. Within a couple of years of moving to Chicago, this would have been around 2005, I became really involved with a church plant in the city, on the north side of the city, and it was an exciting kind of experience. I was young. I was in my early to mid 20s, and was working closely with 2 other young co-pastors that the seminary nearby had sent to revitalize this old urban church. And one of the things, many of us who were involved with that church plant really hoped to see happen was we wanted it to be a racially diverse congregation. That was one of the things that we said right at the outset, and that we talked a lot about, and we spent a lot of time thinking about, how do we become more diverse? And we were there for several years at that church plant, and when we left, the reality is that we were no more racially diverse than we were when we started. It was an overwhelmingly white congregation when we began, and it was, a larger and still overwhelmingly white congregation when my family and I moved away from the church and from the neighborhood. And it wasn't for a lack of effort. It wasn't for a lack of certainly wasn't for a lack of conversation. So obviously this is not an unusual experience. You may know of that very famous Martin Luther King Jr. quote that 10 a.m. Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in the United States. And certainly that was true in the 1960s. It's still true to the present day. There's a vast and growing sociological literature underscoring that Americans tend to be in worship spaces on Sunday mornings, American Christians do, with people that look like them. So why is that? And what should we make of it? Obviously, there's been a lot of thought and attention, effort put into what some have called racial reconciliation, and an effort. Some have thought about kind of segregation as an issue of relationships, and that you just have to build relationships, and it'll kind of take off from there. And it's not entirely without merit. I mean, there is a relational component to this story for sure. But today I want to argue or just sort of suggest to you that in part American churches are so segregated, and in part, a white church like the one that I was attending in Chicago struggles to become more racially diverse, in part because of history and maybe a lack of a kind of full reckoning with history. The truth is, and this is kind of the thing I want to explore, and I teach entire classes on this material, and so we're going to kind of try to move real fast and just give you something a little to think about today. But part of the truth, as I see it, is that in American Christianity, sort of in the history of American Christianity, white churches, even ones in the more contemporary period that have really actively sought to become more diverse, white churches have rarely, in the course of the American past, they've rarely stood up for Black lives. And that really, I want to argue today that is a central reason why white churches like the one that I was at in Chicago do struggle to become more racially diverse. So let me kind of spell that out a little bit, what I mean by that, and Hopefully it will stir a good conversation. I want to start way back, all the way back, way before even the founding of the United States. I don't know how much you know about sort of the story of Christianity and slavery and freedom in the modern world, but there's no question that in the early modern world there were strong connotations, strong associations of Christianity with freedom, that a Christian was a free person, and that therefore when someone was baptized, if they had been enslaved before that they would need to be manumitted. They would need to be free because they were now a Christian. And those ideas that sort of came out of Reformation Europe certainly came over with European settlers to the New World, where in the early going, those strong associations of Christianity and freedom were visible in places like colonial Virginia. What we know is that in the early going, there were a variety of different attempts in terms of who was going to work the plantations in early Virginia. There was an attempt to enslave Native Americans. There were obviously importation of indentured servants from Europe. But by the 1680s, for a complicated variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into today, the planter class in Virginia had decided to make a sharp turn toward West Africa and to start importing en masse, in unprecedented numbers, enslaved West Africans. And as they did that, it created a kind of crisis for Christians in the colonies, and Virginia in particular. The question was, well, what about this whole issue of Christianity and freedom? Part of what we know, and you can find in the historical record, and it's quite disturbing, devastating, distressing, is we have these accounts of Englishmen who came to Virginia in the 1660s, 70s, and 80s. These were missionaries. And what they found when they got to Virginia was that on the ground in the colony, there were a lot of folks who had begun to argue. This is not what they had argued when they first arrived in Virginia 2 generations before. But by the end of the 17th century, people in colonial Virginia were arguing that actually black people could not become Christians. They were starting to kind of make this case that true conversion wasn't possible because of a lack of humanity in the enslaved. Now, not everyone believed that. So certainly some people are making that argument. So you start to see kind of very early a way in which white churches are not standing up for black lives. Others did think that the enslaved could convert and did try some kind of early missions to the enslaved. But even those actually, and this is, again, we can find this in the documentary record, actually modified the liturgy in order to accommodate slavery. So again, there's this older association of Christianity and freedom. It presents a problem in a slave society, and a society that's becoming a slave society. And so what we know is that in places like South Carolina, for example, ministers asked or insisted that before an enslaved person would be baptized, they would take an oath, making clear that in seeking baptism, they were not seeking their freedom. So all the way back at the beginning, you have kind of at the very dawn of American slavery, a kind of insidious intertwining of Christianity with justifications for the oppression of black people. Let's fast forward. So one of the obviously famous seasons in American history is the run-up to the Civil War and the sectional crisis. And obviously it's during those years, starting really in the 1830s and 40s, that you start to get the rise of kind of concerted national movement for radical abolition, by which I mean, this is what we think of when we think of abolitionists. There are actually different kinds of abolition, but these radical abolitionists believed slavery was immoral and needed to be ended immediately. They were sometimes called immediatists. Sometimes I think in the ways that in the church we remember the abolition movement is that this was a Christian movement. And there's no question that there were many, many, many Christians involved. But the reality is that most of the Christians who were involved in the abolition movement were black. There were some white Christians who played prominent roles in the movement. But not very many, and as the percentage of the whole of kind of white Christendom in the antebellum period, a minuscule percentage of white Christians participated, and it was because for many white Christians in that period, it seemed that the power of the pro-slavery Christian position, which was the most widespread position in among white Christians in that era, the power of it was its simplicity, namely that the Bible seemed to give sanction to slavery. And so many white Christians argued in the North and in the South alike that in order to become an abolitionist, you had to give up the Bible. In other words, you really had to leave the faith. The abolitionists were, in the view of the kind of white Christian mainstream, they were heretics. Now, black Christians had a very different way of reading the Bible, and so out of their churches and black Christian leaders, you get a kind of different hermeneutic. These were people who took the Bible very seriously, but didn't find themselves caught in the same kind of hermeneutical circle that so many white Christians did, unable to find a way to argue for abolition from the Bible. So 200 years after more than 200 years after kind of the beginning of American slavery, you have, if anything, white Christians increasingly less able, in most cases, not in every case, but in most cases, to really stand up for black people, black communities, and black lives. What about after the Civil War? Sometimes we think, okay, well, the Civil War happened, but then you get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These obviously granted voting rights to black men. They granted due process rights to the freed men and women. What then? And what we know here again, and I'm going to start to sound like a broken record here at some point, and part of what I do when I talk to my students about this stuff is to say, this is a kind of unrelentingly difficult, even grim story, but there is not without hope. So I do want to say that. But what we know is that in the wake of the Civil War and the adoption of these Reconstruction era amendments, there wasn't suddenly a deep change of heart in white Christian churches. In fact, in the South, Reconstruction faltered and failed by 1877, precisely because white Christians felt deeply oppressed in a society where black people had equal rights. And so they forged paramilitary movements, violent white supremacist movements like the KKK, which really emerged at the same time as the Reconstruction era amendments did, in order to overturn Reconstruction. And in fact, what we know is they were successful, and that when federal troops withdrew in 1877, white Christians called it, quote unquote, the redemption of the South. And by the end of that century, by the turn of the century, had reimposed an unbelievably oppressive regime of racial apartheid, black codes, and lynch law. And in fact, what we know, and sometimes my students find this surprising, maybe you will too, is that for many white Christians in the South, lynching was a Christian activity. It was something that they did in their Sunday best after church, went out and watched the destruction of black bodies. It can't get more gruesome and more sort of further away from standing up for black lives. Actually, white Christians in the South stood by as black lives were snuffed out in the most violent way. But it's also true in the North and in the West, where different forms of Jim Crow also materialized and took root. Race riots in the North as black people start to move out of the South, fleeing lynch law in the South. They flee to the North and eventually to the West, and find that while they had hoped for a kind of promised land in the North and in the West, that in fact that there was a kind of Egypt there too. And we know that white Christians in the North, even some of the kind of most progressive advocates of the early 20th century, people like Walter Rauschenbusch, who's often thought of as the kind of the founder of the social gospel, Rauschenbusch, toward the end of his life, confessed that he had said very little about the plight of black Americans. And his silence spoke volumes about white Christians also in the North who failed to stand up for black lives. What about civil rights? Sometimes we think again of the civil rights era as a movement that was a Christian movement, and again, it was a deeply Christian movement, and it was led by black Christians. And in fact, here again, sometimes depending on the images you're familiar with, you may think, oh well, there were white people marching, and there were. And in fact, an alum of Princeton Theological Seminary, James Reeb, went down to Selma, Alabama in 1965 and marched alongside black civil rights activists there, and was killed for it. And there's a plaque on the outside of Mackay today commemorating his sacrifice. So it's not to say again that there weren't white Christians who led and participated willingly and importantly in this struggle. But the real truth is that on the whole, again, that white Christians did not participate in mass in the civil rights movement. Many white Christians saw Brown v. Board and the integration of public schools as a deep threat to Christian America, a threat to the racial integrity of the entire American project as they understood it. And they marched against it, and they mounted massive resistance against school integration and school busing. Obviously, there were the KKK and kind of racial extremists, but these in many ways were not the folks that civil rights marchers and civil rights activists were most worried about. If you know Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, you know that in that letter, which was addressed to white clergy, he says in that letter that in some sense, to paraphrase, the people that concerned him most weren't actually the KKK and the White Citizens Counselor, but rather the kind of white Christian moderates who stood on the sidelines during this season of marching, during this season of fighting for racial justice, and said nothing. Or said that this had nothing to do with Christianity, that the gospel was apolitical, and that when people marched in the streets and caused trouble, that what they were really doing was straying away from the gospel, which was really just a personal, individual, spiritual kind of message. And King said, those are the folks actually that caused me the most difficulty. Those are the folks that stand most in the way of and the words of the prophet Amos, righteousness and justice flowing down like waters, like a mighty stream. And when King wrote those words in 1963, the civil rights movement had yet to crest. Obviously, 1964, you get the Civil Rights Act. 1965, you get the Voting Rights Act. And it's interesting to see the ways in the last 10 or 15 years as historians have tried to make sense of the post-civil rights era, what's happened between now and then. Why is it that 50 plus years after those kind of the brightest days of this powerful social and moral movement for racial righteousness, why do we still have marches? Why do we still have violence? Why do we still continue to wrestle with race? And I think what historians have increasingly argued is that King was actually right, that in fact the white moderate, it wasn't actually the KKK, it wasn't the George Wallace segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever folks that would cause the most issues in the fight for racial justice. It was the quote unquote, the folks that Nixon called quote unquote the silent majority, the white moderate. That those folks who in fact in many ways would in the wake of the civil rights era, they wouldn't march against racial justice, they wouldn't mount massive resistance to schools, but they would at every step argue that the nation was now colorblind, and that the United States was in fact a meritocracy, so that at the very moment when the civil rights movement is coming around and saying, as King did in 1963 in that March on Washington, he said, "I've come to cash a promissory. We have a promissory note. We've come to cash this check." That so many moderate white Christians, when the civil rights movement came to cash that check, would turn them away. And build powerful grassroots movements to make sure that check never got cashed. Again, this is enough. We could talk about this for days or weeks. I'm really just kind of flying over this material here, but certainly the role of white Christian moderates, the role of the silent majority in the last generation, I think many historians would say, it's played a decisive role in how it is that we come to this place today, where it seems here in 2020 that race still matters so deeply. It divides us so much. And white churches have been a really important part of that story. So how does this relate to questions of identity? How does this relate to the story I told at the beginning about the church plant that I was a part of and our struggle to become more diverse? I think in some ways, we really wanted to have more black people in the pews. We wanted to have more black people in our church. And we thought, it was very clear to us why that would be a good thing. Actually, we all know the verses in the book of Revelation that predict that there's going to be a time when every tribe and tongue and nation bows down and worships the Lord. And, in some sense, I do believe that we're called to live into that beautiful vision already, in the world that we live in. But I think part of what we were doing in that church plant is sort of skipping a bunch of steps. We hadn't really reckoned with the history. We hadn't really asked. It was obvious to us why it would be good for our church if more black people, for example, decided that they wanted to come. I don't know how much we asked whether it would be good for them. I don't know how much we asked what we might need to really change, or what we might need to do, or who we might need to be, if we really wanted to live into that vision of God's kingdom coming. And one of the things that I think for white churches that are struggling with this question, and struggling with what does it mean for us, these kind of the upheaval that we see around us, the ongoing challenge of race and racism in the 21st century. I think that in part we kind of get the order of things mixed up, and part of, I guess, what I want to suggest, and maybe you could talk about this some among yourselves, is maybe the right question isn't, how do we get more black people to come to our church, or how do we get more Christians of color to come to our church? But what would it instead ask this question instead first? What would it mean for us to stand up for Black lives in this community? And I wonder if we start with that question instead, which is a question, again, that white churches have repeatedly failed to ask and repeatedly failed to answer in compelling ways. I wonder if we start with that question, if it will lead us in the direction of that vision, that beautiful vision of God's kingdom as a place where, in fact, all people are going to be centrally involved and together in God's kingdom. So I guess that's the question I want to leave you with is, as you think about race and identity and its importance for you individually and for your congregation, what would it look like to stand up for Black lives? What would it look like to stand up for the lives of Christians of color, people of color in general? And how could you start to sort of answer that question? I'm really excited if you do decide to take it up, and would love to hear where it leads you. Blessings, and look forward to being with you again soon.